Welcome to the Little Sparks Podcast, your home for all things faith and music. I'm Cecilia.
And I'm Tara.
And we're former college roommates, professional musicians, and co-founders of the Hildegard Collective, a space for Catholic musicians to connect with one another and grow in their faith and profession. This podcast is an outreach of the collective, so if you're interested at all in Catholicism, music, or both, this is the podcast for you. Join us each week as we get real, share stories, and learn from other awesome Catholic musicians. We're all little sparks of God's divine creation, so together, let's ignite the world for Christ.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to today's episode of the Little Sparks Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about all things to do with healing injuries, particularly as that relates to New Age practices. I think Cecilia and I both can think of numerous personal examples from our own careers and also people that we know who maybe were encouraged by a doctor or a teacher to engage in some sort of New Age practice that is at the very least very risky to our faith, as a means of helping to heal or overcome an injury of some kind. And it's an unfortunately not uncommon trend in the music industry today. So we wanted to dive into it, talk about why these things are so dangerous, and what are some healthy and safe alternatives that you can turn to if you ever find yourself in this situation.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be diving into this topic. It's one that I've been interested in for a long time now. I guess it's been 6 years actually since I first began my own journey with injuries and healing and all of that, which is wild that it's been that long.
Yeah.
Really wild to think about that. But I've been interested in it ever since. And I think this is going to be great. So I think maybe to start off with, we should probably talk quickly about lay down a basis of why are New Age practices contrary to Catholic moral teaching and our faith. And basically the long and short answer is that you're putting your faith in something that isn't God. Mm-hmm. You're putting your faith in usually like an energy or this kind of general vague spiritual realm. And that's taking the place then of God, putting your faith in God. Mm-hmm. So.
And I think there can be a lot of gray area in this sometimes as well. I think there can be a lot of confusion sometimes about exactly what is okay and what's not. And to a degree, I think that there's some amount of personal discernment that is required with these things. One that I know, for example, that is very heavily debated amongst Catholic circles is yoga, for example. And there is a lot of debate amongst very faithful Catholics about how much your own personal intention matters if you engage with yoga, and then if it's okay to ever engage with. So I think there is a level of your own research that you have to do about some of these things, but then others are just outright dangerous. And when I say dangerous, I mean that kind of going off of the definition that you were using, Cecilia, of putting your faith in something other than God, is because the reason that we would consider that to be an actually dangerous thing to do is because we know that, unfortunately, God is not the only spiritual being whom we can place our trust in. Mm-hmm. And so it gets very dangerous, and it can be a really unfortunate gateway for the demonic, basically. And at the same time, something that I want to clarify, because this is confusion that I hear a lot, particularly from non-Catholics. I don't know how many non-Catholics we have listening to our podcast, but some confusion that I hear a lot is when it comes to what Catholics believe about intercessory prayer and the intercession of saints in particular. and the intercession of our Blessed Mother is people say that when you are praying to the saints, you are putting your faith in something other than God. And so I just want to really quickly spell out the very important and big distinction there is that whenever we ask the saints or people who we believe to be in heaven, even if they haven't been canonized by the church necessarily, or the Blessed Mother or angels, whenever we ask these people to intercede for us, we are not placing our trust in them alone. We're asking them to go and pray to God on our behalf. We're basically asking them to just like support us in front of God, be in our corner. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because it would be problematic if we were elevating saints or angels up to the level of absolute trust that we place in God. And at that point, it becomes something way beyond mere intercessory prayer, and it does actually become dangerous and problematic. But that is absolutely not what we're doing as Catholics when we pray to saints and to angels and ask them to intercede on our behalf. It's really no different than like in school, I remember, right? Like when I would have conflicts with other peers, or maybe like I had to go talk to a teacher about something and I was really scared, and you'd like gather your friends around and be like, guys, you'd explain the situation. You'd be like, can you help me out with this? Can you support me? And they're like, yeah, let's go. We got it. It's really like no different to that. So I just wanted to clarify that before we continue, in case there's anybody for whom that is a point of confusion.
No, I think that's such a good point to bring up. And also, I love the metaphor that you used of like, when you're in school and like, going to the teacher with like your friends. That's such a good metaphor for it, honestly. So yeah, intercessory prayer is not a New Age practice because, yeah, we're asking them to pray for us. One gray area, because you mentioned, there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to some of these things. And one gray area that I want to bring up is the topic of meditation. And the reason that I want to bring this up is because, a lot of times, especially for things like performance anxiety, the practice of meditation is often recommended by teachers, therapists, etc. And what I want to point out there's because in Catholic prayer, there's also such a thing as meditation,
Yeah.
But that's often a little bit different from the meditation that's often being prescribed, so to speak, by teachers or therapists. And where meditation can go a little bit awry, so to speak, is if you're engaging in meditation with the goal of emptying yourself completely. And the reason for that, we can find it actually in the scriptures when Jesus talks about, a man who had 7 demons. The demons were all, cast out, and he went about, kind of like sweeping things out, emptying everything out, and the demons returned stronger than ever before. And basically what was going on was that he was emptying and not filling it with something else. He wasn't filling that with God, So whenever there is a vacuum, something will fill it. Whenever there is empty space, something is going to fill that. So meditation in of itself is not a bad practice to engage in, but the sole goal of that cannot be to just completely empty yourself. You need to be filling yourself with what's good and true and beautiful and ultimately God,
Yeah. I'm actually so glad you brought that up, because anybody who's listened to previous seasons of our podcast or read on our blog will know that like I have my own very, very long journey with extremely severe performance anxiety. And this was something actually that came up a lot for me. And it still kind of does, because I just sort of have an anxious temperament. I am inclined to that sort of way of thinking, and I know this about myself. So I try to kind of preempt that, especially in my day-to-day life, where I'm able to, by, I guess, practicing what some people would consider to be meditation. I don't like to use that word myself. I think just purely because of the attached connotations and
Yeah.
assumptions that people make these days when you use that word. I much prefer to call it contemplation rather than meditation.
Interesting.
And I'm sure there's someone with a much deeper theological understanding out there who could tell me exactly why contemplation and meditation are different things. But for my own purposes in my own life, that is the term that I prefer to use. And it works for me and I like it. And I always, when I was growing up and I was in therapy for my anxiety, and I was working with psychologists, many of whom were practicing Catholics, but some of whom were not. Anytime any sort of mental exercise that could even sort of resemble meditation came up, I hated from my earliest days ever being told to just clear my mind, as if that was some sort of magical solution for whatever was making me anxious. First of all, anybody who is inclined towards anxiety knows, like, it's not exactly that simple of just, okay, let me just not think about anything. Great. Like, there are always, especially in moments when you're feeling anxious and you feel that weight and that heaviness of that anxiety or that panic around you, like, there are so many millions of thoughts running through your heads at every second. Gosh, I wish I could clear my mind of all of those things. But I found what really worked for me instead was, instead of focusing on nothing and trying to just empty my mind of the things that were going on, I tried to instead actively kind of combat any negative thoughts, any anxious thoughts, with something that was good and beautiful and true, and kind of just the opposite of whatever it was that I was experiencing. Mm-hmm. And so it was a much more active process instead of the passivity of sort of just letting all of those things just sort of leave and just empty the cavity of my cranium, right? Choosing to kind of involve my will, engage my will, and also engage my spirit and my relationship with God in the process of not being passive about letting those thoughts and feelings just escape, but to actually take some ownership and say, no, I'm not going to sit by and just like let this happen. I'm going to combat these things with things that I know are good and true and beautiful, and entering into a sort of meditative or contemplative state about whatever it was in that moment that I found helpful. Often for me, like as a child, I would contemplate like the beach, which is like not a particularly spiritual thing, but it was something that I found calming and relaxing. And it's a place my whole life where I have been able to encounter God. So for me, contemplating and kind of doing little visualization exercises to remember that sensation of kind of being on a beach. And what's that like? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? What do I feel when I'm at the beach? And thinking about those things, again, very actively, to kind of help myself remain calm. But then as I got older, it became more theological things, and I could engage with those sort of anxious or negative thoughts with a more kind of prayerful attitude. But I actually think it really was the decision to be like an active participant in combating these things that really helped me to be able to overcome them. And I'm really grateful that I never had any experiences of any sort of positive or even effectiveness to the whole idea of like emptying yourself, because I can understand how for people who really struggle with anxiety, you know, much like myself, I do wonder if I had been really young and something like that had actually worked for me, we might be having a very different conversation right now. I don't know. um,
Yeah.
but so I consider myself very fortunate in that respect. But I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think there's such a danger to this whole idea of just like emptying yourself. It's similar to, in a certain sense, it's kind of similar to what the church teaches about, say, like substance abuse, and how it's a sin to diminish your faculties in that way. And I think meditation sort of diminishes your spiritual faculties and makes it so that you have relinquished control of the sort of spiritual decisions that you make or ways that you behave within your own soul. Um, and much like how when an individual is under the influence of a substance, they often um, find themselves making decisions that might be very out of character, or behaving in ways that they otherwise maybe wouldn't. I think the same thing can definitely be said of like diminishing your spiritual faculties and getting rid um, of those things. Like free human will is like such a critical part of our existence and our experience, and God wants us to be willful participants in our lives and the things that happen to us. And when you diminish your ability to be able to be that like willing participant, like literally nothing good ever happens, ever.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point to bring up, and that's the idea of, the gift of free will really brings us around back to the idea of, intentions, and how with certain things, with some of these like quote unquote more natural healing practices that often get, lumped under, the idea of New Age, or lumped nearby or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's, that what your intention with certain things can be like very, very critical.
Yeah.
And for instance, like a lot of times with various New Age practices, you'll have natural elements being, used for not a good purpose ultimately, because it's directed towards some kind of like energy healing, or something where it's not, where you're not putting your faith in God totally,
Mm-hmm.
you're putting your faith into something else, or something else is replacing God, or it could even be tied to, ancient like gods from various religions, especially from like the Eastern world.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also a lot of times when we have elements from the natural world that on their own, these are not bad things to use,
Yeah.
For instance, like, um, I don't know why, but the first thing that comes into my head right now is like the herb sage. Sage a lot of times is used to
Yeah.
like with like energy stuff, and like, burning it is supposed to be cleansing or whatever, But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing to use sage in every aspect, any other aspect, like I
Yeah.
personally love the good sage rubbed chicken. Very, very good stuff, Um, and like that obviously doesn't have to do with, healing per se. Well, although I suppose you could make an argument that, eating good food is
Sure.
very good for the body. Um, but that's just like, an example of where there are natural elements that on their own can very much be used for good.
Mm-hmm.
And just because they're associated with more New Age practices doesn't make them inherently bad. It's
Yes,
how we're using them?
absolutely. And I think like this can be, again, like a very gray area. Sometimes it's really hard to know where the line is. And there are, I know for sure, therapies and practices and things out there that like I've never even heard of, and that I'm probably going to be introduced to someday, and I'm going to have to go and do my due diligence of research and figure out exactly what this is, um, and try and make a determination to the best of my ability about like whether or not it's okay. And I also think there can be like a lot of fear and a lot of scrupulosity in this area as well, because unfortunately, so many things that actually, as you say, like in and of themselves are not bad at all, have kind of been like co-opted by new age like occultists and stuff like that. And I think it's created and instilled a lot of like deep fear in people of using even some of the like natural gifts and tools that like God has given us. Um,
Mhm.
and so, and I think like it's hard to even know who to talk to about this sometimes. Maybe that's just a problem that I've had. Like, I find it's something that can be like either severely over spiritualized to the point where, you know, eating a sage rubbed chicken could be problematic, or very under spiritualized where suddenly like, oh, everything's okay to do and participate in as long as you're just like doing it for the right reasons or whatever. And I think, like so many things in life, the reality is like somewhere more in the middle.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely, for sure. Well, it's like, virtue is found as the mean between two extremes, you know?
Hmm.
Uh, it's not here, it's not going to be found in scrupulosity, and it's not going to be found in permissiveness either, you
Yeah.
know? This is where really where the virtue of prudence can really come into play. Like it's very handy here. Which just referring back to, a couple episodes ago, that prudence is essentially right reason in action. It's using your conscience to the best of your ability with the facts at hand that doing your due diligence to do research into some of these things, and then making a decision.
Yeah.
For instance, like the topic of yoga, if you look for a church document on yoga, you're not going to find like an official, like papal encyclical, or you're like some document from the magisterium saying yoga is bad.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we look for these documents because in the hopes that the church will have like come down hard and fast on something in terms of like a ruling on any subject that can come to mind. But the church doesn't need to necessarily do that because she's already laid out a guide and foundation in her teachings.
Hmm.
So with yoga, I personally have a big issue with yoga. I tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to it, because the practice of yoga was essentially worship of gods through movement, the Hindu gods. And I don't like the idea of participating in something where that was the original intent,
Hmm.
where and that's not to say that, of course, there are certain like stretches that look like yoga stretches that you can do without practicing yoga.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, if you're being recommended yoga for whatever reason, I would recommend looking into like, more stretching along lines of stretching, and even with
Pilates is great.
Pilates is so good, so good. I was always being told in college to do yoga for this, that, or another thing. I will say, like, in my freshman year of college, I did go to a yoga session, and something about it just didn't sit right with me. And then I started to look into it more, and I was like, I think, using prudence, that right reason in action, if I just decided I couldn't in good conscience do it.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I turned to Pilates, and I love Pilates. Um, Another, like, I guess, alternative out there that I know a lot of people really love is called Soulcore, where it
Mm.
combines stretching with praying the rosary. So then you're having like this really prayerful aspect to your movement and your stretching. And I personally love the idea of that because I love how we're, bodies and souls entwined. And I just think that marries those two so beautifully, the
Hmm.
spiritual and the physical. So soulcore is one that I've really been interested in as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of really good alternatives out there. Um, I do think like I think yoga is one of the trickier ones for sure because I actually do think there's a great deal of personal discernment. I've heard a lot of people say that as long as you're not participating in the spiritual or meditative side of the practice of yoga, it's fine. I myself have never attended a yoga course. I'm just going to put that out there right now. I've never engaged with it whatsoever myself. Um, my limited understanding is that, like, probably most yoga practitioners that you find do include some sort of aspects of the meditative or spiritual worshipful side of yoga. Um, but then, yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. Like I think back to something that comes to mind actually related to this is like Pokemon, right? Because I have heard a lot of people, like a lot of Catholics, say that Pokemon is evil and sinful because originally, back like millennia ago in Japan, some of the like original Pokemon were supposed to be like gods or demons or something in like Japanese culture. But then at the same time, it has developed in such a way that it has like no associations, at least no like clear associations with that anymore at all. And in fact, one of the Pokemon movies is on the Vatican's recommended list of films.
Wait,
So
I had
yeah,
no idea about this.
yeah. So like again, it's one of those that like I can understand and respect if somebody on their own conscience says, even because of that history being there at all, I'm not even touching it. I'm not going near it. That's fine. And if you have peace with that decision, like more power to you. Like that, I applaud you for using your personal prudence to make that decision. But then also, I very much respect the fact that the literal teaching authority of the Catholic Church has recommended a Pokemon movie for people to watch. So like it's it's difficult to know with some of these things, and I think we need to not be afraid of using our personal discernment. I think there's a real like attitude in our modern world that people wish the church made definitive pronouncements on everything so that they could avoid using their personal discernment, because sometimes it's scary and sometimes it's hard, and you can live with this fear of like, what if I'm wrong? What if I try and I do my very best to discern and I get it wrong? Then what happens? And I myself, like, will be the first to say I definitely lived with that fear for a very long time about a myriad of different things. Pretty much every decision I was making in life was like freaking me out because what if I was wrong?
Hmm.
And I eventually kind of came to this conclusion that, and my mom helps me with this. She always reminded me of this. Is like, as long as you are truly doing your best to stay close to God, make the right decision in as much as you can do, and you're availing of the sacraments, you will be totally fine. And God is not going to forsake you or abandon you for making a mistake. um, there might come a time when you are gently redirected in some of your beliefs, some of the decisions you have previously made. And like, in all humility, it's okay to admit when you're wrong about something and like change your view and change your opinion. There are some things right now, in my own life that like I haven't even had the time to process and like come to a decision about what I think about some things that other Catholics feel very strongly about. Um, and I'm sure someday I will know enough to hopefully make a positive informed decision one way or another about all of these different things. All of that is just to say, like, don't be afraid of your own personal discernment. And even if it's different than what other people think in your life. Now, if it's like totally polar opposite from like literally every other like good person you know, maybe think about that. But like generally speaking, like we don't have to be afraid of doing our very best to make, informed decisions about things.
Yeah. I think when in doubt, speaking to a priest can often be very, very helpful in situations like these where, you're not sure if something is okay or permissible to do.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to like more natural healing techniques, is it truly like a natural healing technique or is it new age practice? It's
Yeah.
always a good form to, seek out the counsel of a priest, and chat with him about it. Um, as well as, when it comes to, developing your conscience, this is where, just continually seeking to learn more about the faith really comes into play. We have the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It is a wonderful resource. I really recommend, seeking that out more. As well as, this is where from a practical level, growing in virtue can really help, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just taking the time to make the decision to choose virtue in the little things, it will help because we've talked a lot about prudence, but when you grow in one virtue, you end up actually growing in all of them. They're all interconnected. So, if you're making, a decision that requires more prominently, like, the virtue of justice or fortitude, you're
Mm-hmm.
still growing in prudence as well.
Yeah.
So, so that's just, some food for thought in terms of, practicality sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
I think if I can expand even a little bit more on what you were just saying on like
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
two
Go for
two points. I actually would really recommend speaking to multiple priests if you're having doubts
it.
about something, because my experience in speaking to priests about things like this is that opinions tend to be strong and they can tend to be pretty different. So, something that I have found has really helped me is to speak to multiple priests and ask them not only for their opinion and their guidance, but why they think or
Yeah.
believe a certain way. And I did this once with something that I was struggling with, and I literally went to like Google Maps or something, and I think I picked like 8 different random US cities, and I went to a Catholic parish in each of these cities, and I got the email of the priest off of the website, and it was like literally completely random. Now, I would kind of vet the parishes a little bit to make sure that there was nothing super weird and sketchy going on.
Some
But
had some.
yeah, yeah, prudence. But I like these were priests that I didn't know, didn't know me at all. And I just like basically cold called, emailed all of them with the same copy and pasted email explaining exactly what I was struggling with and saying, can you please give me some guidance? What are your thoughts on this? And when the responses came back in, again, going back to my own kind of use of prudence, I was able to read through them all and kind of pick out points that I agreed with, points that I didn't agree with. And it really helped to like form what I felt was a very healthy and well-rounded view on a particular subject, because I wasn't just relying on the opinion of one single priest and saying like, okay, a priest said this, so it must be true. But it actually gave me really good general oversight from multiple, sound men of God. And that was something that was really, really helpful to me. But then, of course, like if in your own life, if you like have several different priests who you trust, ask them all. Why not? I think like the more you can, the more like sound input you can have into forming opinions and judgments on some of these things, like I personally find that to be really helpful. Even if a priest comes back to me, with an opinion or a view that I ultimately don't agree with or like don't think is correct, at least then I've been able to discern and use my own prudence to determine that like I personally don't agree, and like that's okay. If it's not something that the church has made like an official pronouncement on, then it is like up to us to use our virtue and the tools that we have in our spiritual toolbox to kind of make that decision.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to say about the point you were making is I fully agree, and I hope everything I just said makes it clear. I fully agree that like you want to, do research and be informed about these things. It's also though really easy to fall into the trap of getting sucked into like a black hole of research about these things.
Yes, that
And
is true.
that's not always helpful for everybody. I have found that everybody, especially because when it comes to like new age practices and stuff, this conversation can be very nuanced and it can be very dark at some points. And I find people have different thresholds for understanding and just being able to sit peacefully with some of these topics. And I think it's really important to say, if you're doing a bunch of research, you could be coming across a whole plethora of opinions and arguments, some of which could be very surface level and some of which could be very deep and dark and scary. And
Mhm.
it's okay to back away. Like, you don't need to know absolutely everything
Yeah.
about everything to make an informed decision. And like, it's okay to cap off your research and say, okay, I know enough. Or if you are reading something and you find it's starting to freak you out or like steal your inner peace, like leave it, walk away from it. It's not that important. Um, in order to kind of be an effective follower of Christ, like doing what you can to maintain the peace in yourself and the peace in your heart is really, really critical. Like, don't forget, like, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He wants that to be predominant in your temperament and in your soul and in your heart. So if you feel like you are reading something to research or to understand that is stealing that peace away from you, it does not make you any less capable of understanding or making a judgment about something, and it does not make you any less of a good person or a good Catholic for you to walk away and say, I'm not going to finish this research. Like, I want to be super clear about that, because I see a lot of people, again, myself included, have fallen into this trap of reading and researching ad nauseum, where it actually ends up being really disturbing to their souls. And like,
Yeah.
we don't want that either. And it's okay to walk away.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like just to go off of that, there are so many opinions out there on the internet. There are so many, self-proclaimed theology gurus and whatnot. Armchair theologians, you can say, for about a lot of them, versus, people with any real substance and knowledge. Um, it's really important to go to the source first. If you're going to go research a topic, go to what are our primary sources, as Catholics.
Mhm.
Um, this is kind of a technique that I'm borrowing from a history class that I took in college, where, it was really honed into us to look for primary sources for our research. So as Catholics, what are our primary sources? That would be the Bible, the Catechism, first and foremost. And so go there first,
Yeah.
and then And then from there, other official magisterium documents, papal encyclicals, that sort of stuff. Um, while it can be helpful to have, lay people break things down for us sometimes, it can also be overwhelming, as you were saying. And there are, we have to be able to separate the weeds from the wheat as well. There are going to be some people out there that are going to have really helpful content, and there are some people out there that do not have helpful content,
Yeah.
objectively speaking. So, again, prudence. But I really recommend, when you're doing your research, go to those primary sources first
Hmm.
before going to some person on the internet's opinion. You know what I mean?
Yes, 100%, 100%. I think that's a really important point. Um, so for those who might find themselves in a situation where they maybe have already engaged with some sort of new age practice that makes them uncomfortable, or they're being encouraged to deal with an injury or to deal with performance anxiety or something similar. Let's talk about some healthy alternatives.
Amen to that. I can list a couple immediately off of the top of my head. Alexander technique and
Mhm.
body mapping. Both of these are not new age practices. They are learning about your body and the way that it was designed to function in a holistic manner, in the way that God intended it to be, even if your practitioner is not, specifically saying, this is how God made the body. Most of them are not going to be saying that. However, it is entirely based on anatomy, human anatomy, and just how the way that we were designed to work. And I will never forget, I did Alexander Technique lessons in my junior year of college, and the woman I was taking Alexander Technique lessons with was a really lovely woman. But I remember one day she said that our bodies were designed to be free. And immediately my first thought was, that's theology of the body right there. God designed us to live freely. He designed us with the gift of free will, and that freedom that we were meant to live in is not just expressed in our souls, it's meant to be expressed in our bodies as well. And when you look at what causes injuries, it's usually, it has to do with stress or tension, using your body incorrectly. These are all going against that design of, living in freedom and harmony with God, right?
Mm,
So, and I mean, I know that there is such a thing out there as good stress, but it's bad stress that causes injuries, right?
yeah.
Uh, so just to clarify that really quickly, in case anyone is thinking, well, what about good stress, Um, but so Alexander technique is really, really wonderful for that. Body mapping is similar along those same lines of, living in harmony with your body in terms of just knowing how things are meant to function
Yeah.
and working with the design of your body. So those are both incredibly, incredibly useful techniques. Physical therapy, there's another one. Physical therapy is a really helpful, or occupational therapy as well,
Yeah.
really helpful for recovering from injuries. If you can, I really recommend, just from my own personal experience, finding a physical or occupational therapist that looks at your whole medical history, your whole, takes like everything into account, not just the injury that's going on,
Yeah.
because there is a major difference. I've been to physical therapy for my carpal tunnel and tendonitis, and the couple physical, well, I had one physical therapist and one occupational therapist that both really just looked at the injury site and just, worked with the injury site, and it never lasted ever. The progress that I made, it just didn't stick. And then the third therapist I went to, another physical therapist, did look at things from a more whole person point of view.
Hmm.
And like the first appointment I had, she talked to me about my entire medical history, had me go through all of that with her. And because of that, we were able to find that there were some other things going on in my body that were making it difficult for me to heal from
Mm,
tendonitis and carpal tunnel. And that's something that the other two therapists had missed because they were just looking at the site of the injury. So if you can, when it comes to physical and occupational therapy, see if you can find someone who will look at, your full medical history and look at everything and not just the site of the injury.
Yeah, totally. For singers, like speech therapy is a great
Mm.
one. And often, like if you are suffering some sort of vocal injury or illness, you often will be recommended, like referred on to a speech therapist. I feel like that's the kind of closest equivalent we have in the voice world. But similarly, like I actually loved what you said, Cecilia, about how our bodies are designed to be free, and the voice is no different than that. And I feel like it's difficult with the voice because it is so internal. It's very difficult to visibly see what's going on with the voice in the same way that it is with instrumentalists if you have like a misplaced finger or you're holding tension, say in your wrist or something when you're holding your instrument. Um, so I feel like mostly what I kind of see for dealing with vocal tension in singers is things that are very new age. Like we're talking like people get sent on retreats and stuff like that to just like learn to be free and empty yourself and things like that, which we've already discussed exactly why that's dangerous. But I have found it helpful myself. I have not yet found like a formalized sort of Catholic equivalent of like learning how to free your voice, as like Alexander technique teaches you to do with your body. But I've kind of delved down a little bit of that road just myself personally, and I found it to be really helpful. So I definitely would recommend approaching your singing and your recovery if you're dealing with some sort of illness or injury with that same sort of mentality yourself. And if anybody out there knows of like a Catholic alternative for vocalists, please let us know. Like that's actually something I've been interested in and looking for many years and haven't yet successfully found. We've already kind of discussed how great Pilates is. I also did Pilates for a long time, not actually as an alternative to yoga, but it was recommended to me by an orthopedic surgeon because of this, like the scoliosis that I have in my spine. I
Oh,
was
see.
like in a back brace for a number of years until my growth plates closed, and then when my x-rays started showing that my growth plates had closed, the orthopedic surgeon considered my spine and like the curvature of my spine to be stabilized, but because it still had a what they would consider to be like moderate curvature in two different places in my spine, he recommended that I go to Pilates as a means of strengthening the muscles around those vertebrae to
Oh,
kind of
interesting.
combat any sort of muscular imbalance that could potentially pull unevenly on those bones and like potentially worsen the curve. And I loved Pilates. I am the least athletic person who has ever lived, but I had such a great experience um, in my time doing Pilates, and I really, really would recommend it, even just in general as a form of exercise for musicians, because the bodily awareness and the muscular awareness that you develop from the practice of Pilates, I have personally found to be like unparalleled. It was really life changing and perspective changing for me.
Mhm.
So definitely highly recommend Pilates. Um, I
Pilates are
also kind
great.
of talked earlier in the episode as well about my personal kind of alternative for meditation, basically. I don't know if you have any recommendations on that front, Cecilia, for combating like something that's going on mentally, whether that's performance anxiety or burnout or anything like that.
I don't know so much as I think I was never the best about, developing like prayer routines and stuff like that before before performances and whatnot. Though I would always try to dedicate, my performances to God. I think because I dealt with severe performance anxiety for quite a long time after my carpal tunnel. And where it would mainly come out, weirdly enough, was my bottom lip would shake. And that is no good as a flute player at all. Because your flute is literally bouncing off of your lip and it's like creating a weird noise and yeah, terrifying. It's horrifying. Um, and it would always like come on about halfway through like a solo performance, and I would be like,
Of
oh,
course.
oh, here we go again. I thought I was doing so good. What's happening? I know this is easier said than done. I think the game changer for me was simply choosing that I was going to enjoy this performance and I was not going to throw all kinds of weight into it. I was going to approach it as, I've put in the effort and I'm going to enjoy this. And it might
Mhm.
not all come out the way that I wanted it to, but I'm just going to enjoy this. And that was my master's recital. And I have never had so much fun playing my flute in my life.
Yeah.
And maybe it did help that, granted, I strategically placed the most difficult piece in the entire program at the very, very beginning. So I got it done with and then didn't have that hanging over my head. So that
Nice.
totally could have been coincidental. Um, but we do have power with our minds, and it might not always work out the first time or the second time or the third time, but I do think that we have the ability to some degree at least, to just choose to enjoy performing.
Yeah.
And it does take some self-mastery and trial and error, but I think that if that's the goal, to enjoy it and ultimately to offer it up to the Lord, no matter what, um, I think that that can go a long way in addressing performance anxiety.
Yeah, totally. And I actually think we could probably do like a whole other episode just on healthy mentalities about performing and practicing and all this stuff because wow, that is a minefield. Um, One last thing that I will recommend for mental health related stuff is therapy.
Yes.
Um, Therapy is great. I honestly can't recommend it highly enough. There's a great website if you're living in the US called catholictherapist.com. And you can search by location and they can refer you to Catholic therapists. And there are all different kinds, like they have different qualifications and things like that, so that you can kind of choose a practitioner and a therapist who is right for you. But they all have profiles on this website. And I have found that going to Catholic therapists has been particularly effective and particularly life changing because the kind of conversations that you could have when you understand and know that there's a basis of a common faith there is so drastically different to people who might not be practicing their faith or might not have faith at all. So I really, really recommend checking out that website. I've used it myself several times and always found it to be very, very helpful. And like Cecilia said, like there are so many resources out there for you to avail of if like mental health is something that you're struggling with. Um, and whether it is physical or mental health that you are battling in your music career, we have all been there. I would venture to say many, if not most of us, are still there in some capacity. I think this is like a lifelong, ongoing battle in this career. So just know that you're never alone and know that it is never worth turning to new age practices, no matter how desperate you might feel to resolve whatever situation you're in. There are always healthier alternatives. And if you ever want to talk to someone about this or need advice or help, in as much as we are able to provide that, please do like send us a message or send
Yeah.
us an email or something, and we would like love to get in touch and see how we can help you out because I think it's one of the most tragic things when um, really solid Catholic musicians turn to practices that are not okay because they're just so desperate to recover. So,
Absolutely. And just one quick final like caveat on what you were saying with therapy as well with, um, not all therapists are going to be the right fit for you.
mhm.
And, so if you have an experience, like if you with a Catholic therapist, like the first one that you've been to, that isn't a good experience, yeah, I wouldn't chalk it up to it, being a Catholic therapist. I would
Yeah.
chalk it up to this person is not a right fit for you. Find someone else. So
Hmm.
keep looking if the first person that you go to see is not a good fit for you, keep looking. Um,
Very good point.
yeah, just wanted to throw that out there.
Excellent. Well, I think with all that being said, let's talk about what we've been listening to this week.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask that you go first because I need to collect my thoughts on that.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Um, so this weekend particularly was very personally exciting. The choir that I manage, called Lorca, went to their very first um, major competition. It was the Derry International Choir Festival, and they won the whole thing, which was like not,
So,
yeah, it's great. It was like a little bit unexpected, I think, because there was some stiff competition. Like there were some really, really, really good choirs and very experienced choirs that showed up to this competition. This group is like basically just had its first birthday. It's like a very baby group, and we've had a lot of change in personnel and a change in singers, huge changes in repertoire. And so when we entered this competition, our director was like, let's just go and have fun, do our best, have a good experience, bond as a group, but like we're not going to make winning our ultimate goal this time
mhm.
around. And everybody was like okay with that. Um, Now, that being said, the director is like, he can be pretty intensely competitive sometimes, which is not a bad thing at all. And so I would imagine they probably had a good few productive rehearsals when they went up there, and they ended up coming out on top anyway, winning the whole thing. So
Oh man.
basically, my whole week has been filled with choir music, which I will never complain about. I think that it's great and it's beautiful, and I just absolutely love listening to it. Um, and what I have spent so much time on this week listening to is this piece called Cormacus Scripsit.
Ooh.
And it's basically it's from a 12th century Irish psalter, right? And it's basically this 12th century monk named Cormac wrote in like the margin of the psalter. Like, kids in like their school textbooks will be like, Bob was here or whatever. Basically,
Yeah.
this monk wrote like Cormac was here, but he the note that he wrote in the margin basically translates to Cormac wrote this, pray for the reader of this psalter, basically. And yeah, and there was some music that appeared with this little marginal note in the psalter. And so it's been adapted, probably most famously by the group Anuna for choir, but
Hmm.
it's actually not the like original 12th century like transcript. And
Oh,
one of the pieces that Lorca brought to this competition was actually the original music that's in that 12th century Psalter. And it was
wow.
really cool. And now, if you've ever entered choir competition before, one of the things that they generally ask is for original copies of the music that you're singing so that
Yeah.
they can make sure that everybody has correctly licensed the pieces, so on and so forth,
Right.
which totally makes sense. Obviously, 12th century, that's like pretty comfortably in the public domain, but
I'd say so, just a
the
bit.
but the folio of
Mm.
this manuscript is owned, I think, by the British Museum. And in order to get a non-watermarked photocopy of this folio, you have to pay them. So I paid out of pocket like 20 euro, or maybe it was 20 pounds, I don't remember, for a copy of this like 12th century folio. And if you've ever looked at like music from that time period, unless you are like very highly trained, you can't really read it. So having paid this money, I mailed this music into the competition, and they came back and they were like, our adjudicators can't read this. And I was like, no kidding. It's from the 12th century. So on Friday, I spent like basically my whole afternoon like by hand, like transcribing the
Oh my
music.
God.
And it like took a good few hours. And I was like listening at the same time to the way that the choir was singing it, and kind of trying to notate that accordingly on the score. And then I like resubmitted it to the competition, and all was fine and well. And I was actually very proud of my transcription work on that piece. I thought it turned out really well. But given that transcription work, I listened to this piece like literally for hours. But again, can't complain. It's great. It's beautiful. And I actually really thoroughly enjoyed my time listening to it. So that is going to be my recommendation for this week. And I'll see if I can find online anyone else singing the like original transcript, like from the 12th century folio, as opposed to the kind of made up version that is more popular these days. But yeah, if I can find it, we'll definitely link it below. But it's a great piece of music, and I think it's hilarious that it's just like a marginal note in a psalter. It's like kind of funny.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
What about you, Cecilia?
Mine's a lot simpler. So I've been listening to this playlist called An Autumn Gone By, and it's a lot of like just really cute songs from like the 30s, 40s, 50s about autumn. And, you know, being in Florida, we don't really get autumn the way that I got it in Pennsylvania. And this time of year, I have been very blessed to have been able to go up to Pennsylvania a couple times this fall for various, you know, family things, a wedding, you know, so forth and so forth. And I've gotten my taste of fall through that. But when I've not been up there, I have been listening to this playlist. And it's just very lovely. It has all the fall vibes. So I will be linking to that below my playlist.
Love a fall vibe. That's great. That sounds really peaceful.
Well, on that note, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week. God bless.
God bless. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Little Sparks podcast. For more information on this podcast and our ministry, please visit www.thehildegardcollective.com.